Picture walking through a rainforest and hearing something unexpected. Not a bird, not an insect, not the distant call of another animal, but a low, quiet hum. You follow the sound and discover something enormous sitting among the vegetation. A gorilla. And it's eating. It isn't making a loud warning call. It isn't trying to scare anyone away. It's just sitting there, chewing its food and humming. And this isn't something researchers simply made up because gorillas look like they're enjoying a meal. Scientists have actually recorded wild gorillas doing this. But here's where the story gets more interesting. We don't completely know what the humming means. So why would a gorilla make a sound while eating? Let's get into it. The gorilla with a soundtrack. Gorillas have an impressive collection of sounds. They grunt. They scream. They make calls to one another. And among their vocalizations are two particularly interesting food-associated sounds that researchers describe as humming and singing. The humming is generally a prolonged, tonal sound. In simple terms, imagine one long, steady note. The singing is different. Instead of one sustained sound, it consists of several short sounds at different pitches, produced close together. And researchers have noticed something remarkable about when these sounds appear. They are strongly associated with feeding. In a detailed study of wild western lowland gorillas in the Republic of Congo, researchers followed two groups and recorded hundreds of feeding sessions. They documented 327 food-associated calls during 827 feeding bouts. And the connection to food was striking. The researchers did not find these calls randomly scattered throughout the gorilla's daily activities. They were overwhelmingly associated with feeding. In fact, 92% of the recorded calls happened while the gorillas were actually feeding. So this isn't simply a gorilla making random noises while sitting around. Something about food appears to be connected to the behavior. But that raises a much bigger question. What are they communicating? Maybe it's not just about the food. The obvious explanation is probably the one most people would think of first. Maybe the gorilla is happy. Maybe it found something delicious. Maybe it's basically saying, "This is good." And honestly, it's a fun idea. But science has to be more careful than that. Researchers cannot simply hear a gorilla humming and declare that it is experiencing the same kind of enjoyment a human experiences while eating a favorite meal. We don't know that. What scientists do know is that the calls are associated with feeding and that the type of food matters. Some foods were much more likely to produce calls than others. Aquatic vegetation had the highest probability of producing these vocalizations in the study, followed closely by seeds. Insects were much less likely to trigger them. That is an important clue. Because if the gorillas were simply making the sound because they were hungry, you might expect eating to be enough. But apparently, what they're eating can make a difference. And that makes the mystery much more interesting. A gorilla doesn't need to say, "I'm eating." Think about what happens when a group of gorillas finds a good feeding spot. Everyone doesn't necessarily have to sit together in one giant pile. They spread out. They move through vegetation. They pick different parts of plants. They search for food. And the forest can be noisy. Leaves move. Branches snap. Animals make sounds. Visual contact isn't always perfect. So communication becomes important. A quiet vocalization could potentially carry information about what an individual is doing without creating the kind of disturbance caused by a loud call. Researchers have suggested that these food-associated vocalizations may play a role in social communication. One possibility is that a gorilla's call could help communicate something as simple as, "I'm still here, and I'm still feeding." That may sound almost ridiculously ordinary. But in an animal society, ordinary information can be useful, especially when several individuals are moving, feeding, and keeping track of one another. And then there's the silverback. Here's where the story gets even more interesting. The researchers found that food-associated calling wasn't equally common among every gorilla. Adults called more frequently than younger animals. Males also accounted for much of the calling. And this matters because of the way gorilla groups are organized. A typical gorilla group can contain several individuals, but the silverback male plays a particularly important role in group movement and protection. So imagine the group is feeding. The silverback is sitting somewhere, eating. If he suddenly gets up and leaves, other members may eventually follow. But what if he's still feeding? A food-associated vocalization could potentially help signal that he's occupied with food rather than preparing to move. This is one reason researchers have discussed the possibility that these sounds may have a social function. But again, we need to be careful. That doesn't mean scientists have proven that gorillas are literally saying, "Don't go anywhere. I'm still eating." That's an interpretation of what the behavior might accomplish. The exact meaning remains uncertain. And that's actually one of the coolest parts of this story. The quietest gorilla in the room. There's another fascinating detail. During most feeding bouts where these calls were recorded, only one gorilla was vocalizing. About 86% of the calling bouts involved a single individual. Sometimes two gorillas called at the same time. Very rarely, three did. That tells us something important. This isn't necessarily a giant gorilla choir where everyone starts humming together whenever food appears. Usually, one individual is making the sound, and occasionally, another joins in. Researchers even recorded situations involving combinations such as a silverback and his male offspring. So there can be a social element to who is calling and who is responding. But again, we shouldn't turn that into a human conversation that scientists haven't demonstrated. We don't know that one gorilla is saying something and another is answering with a specific message. What we know is that their vocal behavior changes depending on the feeding situation. And that alone is fascinating. Gorillas aren't just making random noise. This brings us to a bigger question. How much information can an animal communicate with sound? Humans have incredibly flexible language. We can describe something that happened yesterday. We can explain something that will happen tomorrow. We can invent imaginary worlds. We can talk about mathematics, history, space, and whether pineapple belongs on pizza. Gorillas obviously don't communicate in human language. But that doesn't mean their sounds are meaningless. Animal communication can be surprisingly sophisticated. Different calls can appear in different situations. And in gorillas, researchers have identified many different vocalizations associated with different social and behavioral contexts. Food-associated calls are particularly interesting because they appear to be connected to something specific, feeding. And because the calls aren't produced equally across every food type or every individual, researchers can investigate whether those differences carry information. That's where this seemingly simple humming becomes scientifically valuable. What does the humming actually mean? Here's the honest answer. We don't know yet. And that sentence is important. The original researchers described their work as a first detailed investigation into food-associated calling in wild gorillas. They weren't claiming to have translated gorilla language. They were identifying patterns. And those patterns give scientists clues. The calls occurred overwhelmingly in feeding situations. Certain foods were more likely to produce them. Adults called more than younger gorillas. Males accounted for much of the observed calling. And most feeding bouts with calls involved only one individual vocalizing. Those are observations. From those observations, scientists can develop hypotheses. Maybe the calls communicate information to nearby group members. Maybe they help coordinate feeding. Maybe they are connected to the gorilla's emotional state. Maybe they serve several purposes depending on the situation. Future research can test those possibilities. That's how science works. You observe something strange. You collect evidence. You find patterns. Then you try to figure out why those patterns exist. And the word singing can be misleading. There's one more thing worth clearing up. Researchers sometimes describe one of these behaviors as singing. That doesn't mean gorillas are sitting around composing songs. The term describes the acoustic pattern of the vocalization. Remember the difference? Humming is a prolonged, tonal sound. Singing involves multiple short sounds at different pitches. Scientists use those labels because they help describe what they're hearing. It's similar to calling an animal's movement a dance without suggesting the animal learned choreography. The terminology is useful. So, are gorillas enjoying their food? Maybe, but we shouldn't claim that as a proven explanation. What we can say is much more interesting. Wild gorillas produce distinctive vocalizations while feeding. Those sounds are closely associated with particular feeding situations. Different foods can affect how likely the calls are to occur. And the behavior appears to have a social dimension that scientists are still trying to understand. So the next time you see a gorilla quietly humming while eating, there's more happening than a cute animal enjoying lunch. You might be watching a form of communication whose exact meaning scientists are still working to decode. And that's the strange thing about studying animals. Sometimes the most interesting discoveries aren't the moments when we finally get an answer. They're the moments when we realize we've been asking the wrong question. Maybe the mystery isn't simply, why is the gorilla humming? Maybe it's, what is that hum telling the other gorillas? And until researchers can answer that, the rainforest still has a little conversation we haven't completely learned how to hear. So, the next time somebody tells you gorillas just sit around eating all day, you can tell them there's apparently a soundtrack involved. If you enjoyed this little trip into the weird side of animal behavior, you know what to do. Hit like if you want more strange facts that actually have science behind them, and subscribe if you want to keep going down the rabbit hole with us. No pressure. But if you leave without subscribing, well, the gorillas might notice. Probably. Maybe.